you were hugely successful at a corporate level with Levi's. And then you got into what I think, now this is just me giving my opinion. I'm not putting words in your mouth. You can say what you want. This is just my opinion from the outside looking in, to a real hypocritical situation. You started to advocate against school closure and mask mandates. And they had a problem with that because you were very high up in the corporation and they didn't see how you could separate your personal situation as a mother and having those private interests not reflecting on the corporation with you being in a high position. That was their point, right?
Yeah, you got it.
So they said, we want you to quiet down.
Yes, repeatedly for 2 years. Can you stop? You need to stop. You need to think about, when you speak on behalf of the company. I said, no, I don't. I'm a mom of 4. I'm a mom of public school kids. I'll take Levi's out of my bio. I'll take my title out of my bio. I'm talking on behalf of children, as I've done for the last 10 years in the sport of gymnastics. Are you telling me to stop? No, we can't. Okay, then I won't. That was sort of the conversation for 2 years.
Now, this is not a corporation that didn't speak out about social issues, correct?
Yeah, often led by me. I mean, I was the chief marketing officer for 8 years, so I led the messaging. Oftentimes, look, Levi's is a company that has a long history of what they would call it profits through principles, progressive values. It started, Levi Strauss himself at the inception of the company, the first profits he made, he gave to an orphanage. This was sort of in the DNA of the company. And the approach had been very much about taking care of employees. So the best example of this is in 1992, they were the first Fortune 500 company to offer same-sex partner benefits. That's before anyone talked about marriage equality. So there was a whole series of events integrating factories in the South before the law required it. But at a certain point in the 2010s, we started to talk more publicly about these things. And that was led by me. So, I'll own that. But the issue here was the company was not taking a stance on this. And so if the brand president was, it appeared that we had a perspective on it. I'm representing their view, when in fact we did not. When in fact the company's perspective was, we're going to adhere to local public health guidelines, which said public schools should be closed. Now, I should mention throughout this, starting in the fall of 2020 anyway, all of my peers who were telling me to stop were sending their kids to in-person private school. So, their pushback with me was that I was violating and going against the CDC and the public health authorities in the local area, in the Bay Area. I didn't say this at the time, but what I would say now is, no, you were. You sent your kids to public school. My kids were home on Zoom.
Right. So they were saying one thing publicly, but personally, privately, they were sending their kids to private schools where they were in the classroom.
That's right. The hypocrisy of that made me so crazy. I can't even, I guess they think I'm crazy, but it just roiled me to no end because the harms were so obvious and they're widely reported now, the harms of the school closures, the learning loss and the, emotional, social, developmental loss and the depression and the teen girls are suffering and all of these things, the learning loss being the starkest for those states that were closed the longest. California was closed the longest. This was all obvious to me. Europe prioritized opening schools in May of 2020, and then what we would call red states did so in August of 2020. It just all seemed so inherently classist and frankly racist to me that the kids being kept out of schools were the lower income schools, largely Black and brown students. And I didn't understand how anybody could sit by and accept that when everything in the ether was, we're fighting for equality. I didn't understand it. I didn't.
Well, I think people just pick and choose when they want to pay attention to science and when they don't. The idea of pushing for school openings got conflated with being anti-science.
Yeah.
And you got called a COVID denier. The fact of the matter is, there was not then, there hasn't been during the pandemic, nor is there now any solid science to suggest that closing the schools was ever empirically supported, that there was ever any data that suggested that this was in the best interest of the children, physically, mentally, emotionally, medically, or otherwise.
That's correct. And if you're going to call me anti-science and a COVID denier, then you'd have to call all of Europe, literally all of Europe, anti-science COVID deniers, because they prioritize children and they open schools. You know, someone might come back with a retort saying, well, yeah, but they had to close an extra week at Christmas. I'm sorry, that is not the same thing. California schools were closed for 18 full months. So it's just, they prioritize children. I think the other issue, Dr. Phil, is just this myopic view of public health as being about one thing and one thing only. And we created through policies all of these unintended consequences, although I think they could have been predicted, and adverse impacts that for children are more harmful than the disease itself.
Well, you're certainly reading my mail here, because from the very beginning, the position that I have taken, and there are others that have done the research, not on this pandemic, but where there have been prolonged quarantines in other countries, such as Peru, where there have been extended quarantines where children have been held out of school, and they have looked at what has been the impact of remote learning, particularly in the lower grades, where there has been remote learning, and they've measured it going into the quarantine and coming out of the quarantine. These are quantitative studies. These aren't opinions. They measure what the child knows going into the quarantine and experiencing remote learning, and what they know coming out of the quarantine and remote learning, and they virtually learn nothing. Certainly in the lower grades. It impacts most the lower socioeconomic children, the children of color. They have poor connections to the internet. They have fewer devices in the home. Their parents are less apt to work from home because they have jobs where they have to be on site to perform the tasks, so the children are left to their own devices. There are a number of confounding factors. We also know if a child is not reading on grade level at the end of third grade, their likelihood of dropping out before graduation is 6 times normal. The number of years of life lost ultimately is staggering for these children, because they have less occupational attainment, which means they're higher risk jobs with lesser insurance coverage, slower disease detection. All of this stuff obtains. There's not anything that points to this being a good thing for the children, mentally, emotionally, or physically.
That's right, which is why the pre-pandemic playbook, as published by the CDC, said we never close schools longer than 6 weeks, even in the very worst situations with pandemics and with diseases that are more severe in terms of the fatality rate. We don't close longer than 6 weeks because the harms are just too great. But we threw all that out the window, and we knew all of that, what you just said, that if a child doesn't read by third grade, his likelihood of dropping out is increased exponentially. And this isn't even to speak of the services that kids get in school beyond. I mean, some kids eat because they get to go to school. You know, if you are in San Francisco, where I used to live, 60% of children are on the free or reduced lunch plan. That means they got lunch, they got breakfast, and a snack to take home. The schools tried to facilitate that, but it didn't really work. There's social services provided. There's abuse intervention. There's all of these things that just didn't happen. And at the same time, in San Francisco anyway, they had these learning hubs. So that, where children could go with decent internet service. So these are staffed by hourly wage workers. Why can these people go to work? Why can we subject these hourly wage workers to babysitting these children, and that wasn't considered dangerous, but a school with, aggressive mitigation policies couldn't have a teacher in the classroom? Even when San Francisco schools opened, and I hesitate to call it open, in May for a few hours, You had situations where the kids were in the classroom and the teacher was at home on Zoom. That's not school either. So the whole thing, we knew the harms. It's not 2 weeks, 2 months. It's potentially a lifetime for far too many children. And that doesn't even get at the children in third world countries who were sold into child marriage and went to work and will never go back to school, that followed our lead, frankly. They followed the lead of the United States in closing schools. And it's just a culture that does this, a society that does this does not value its children.